All right, we're just about at noon, so I'm going to go ahead and get started since Deb was kind enough to get the recording going. So first off, thanks to Deb Dandino for getting all of this together. It's worked out really kind of flawlessly. Drove up, there was a parking space for me. That's the first thing at the powerhouse, right? So we had the parking space. Lots of people are coming on board. It's good to have you here. And we will go ahead and get started. So the title is AI and IP, 7 letters and 7 challenges. The reason for that is because it was the shortest request I've ever had in my career for a talk. The title was literally AI and IP. And so I said, yeah, I can do that. I can go ahead and give a talk on AI and IP. And so I organized it around 7 challenges that I think will really give you a good idea of where we're going to go with intellectual property and AI. So let's go ahead and get started. That being said, so first off, just to get you going here, in case the pizza's kind of making you sluggish, here's a pre-quiz. Why do you think Ed Ott is here? Is there anything special about Ed Ott? Anybody know? Anybody know about Ed Ott? Catcher for the Pirates in the late 70s, was their catcher in the World Series? That's not what this is about. It is the shortest name in the history of professional sports. Ed Ott. 5 letters. His name is literally Ed Ott. You can see it on his old baseball card. 5 letters. So Ed Ott is the shortest name in history of baseball. This is the shortest name I've ever had for a talk. AI and IP. So that does have that analogy there. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Why am I here? I'm not going to go through this. It's an eye chart, but the bold-faced is the important stuff. I built my first AI system almost 40 years ago as an undergrad. I was told in the early 2000s at HP that it was a career-limiting move to stay in AI and that I was making a big mistake and that I would pay the price for that down the road. I sure am, right? And I also have a lot of patents and teach a patenting class. I do a lot of AI and analytics and have a class in there. These are just an example of some of the AI and machine learning projects that I've worked on, mostly at HP, but also at NASA and as a student. So everything from auto recognition for images all the way up to exercise responsive pacemakers and forensic imaging devices. So a broad set of those across the board, if you will. And the whole point is, I think in most cases with AI, what you want to do is make sure you're not just locking in on one thing, that you are actually expanding your horizons, play around with it a little. And then also why me, these are books that are related to AI or have some AI content in that I have been the author on. And you'll notice some other nice names on there. Marie Vans is also a professor in systems engineering. And Dallin Simske is also a Simske. And he graduated from here. And it was a combination of liberal arts with cybersecurity, talking about mistruth in history and how we could use patterns of mistruth in history to actually build better cyber systems. So again, across the board. Now, this is the one slide, I guess, that I am borrowing here. I gave this originally at the CodeBot 25 at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And these were like 5 themes of IP and that in AI that can somehow apply to IP, but I actually took these and boiled them down into a different set. But again, these introduce some of the terms that you may or may not be familiar with. When AI lies, it's called hallucination. When AI has recency bias, that means that it's deprecated a lot of old data and may not know anything else. And we also know with generative AI, because of the big retraining, you can't ask it something that happened last week necessarily. You might have to go back 6 months. So you have to be really careful with those types of things. Anyway, we'll involve all of this as we move through here. And you'll notice that this one happily ended with energy, which is where I'm going to end my talk today because we're here in the powerhouse. So it just seemed kind of appropriate. All right, so that's how we kind of go to get started. This is what we're going to be talking about today. Excuse me. We're going to view and address AI and IP through the perspective of 7 research challenges that it poses. And I don't expect all of this to be familiar to all of you. There'll be some parts here where you're kind of going, okay, I'm not sure I knew about that. That's okay. Don't feel badly about that. But it is based on history. We've seen already over the past 15 years, wow, there were people getting software patents on absolute rubbish, just taking something that already existed and saying, oh, I did it in software, give me a patent. Well, the Alice Law struck that down in 2014, and we're going to see, using that as a precursor, we're going to see where this goes with intellectual property and IP. And this will help frame out how the future will involve AI in the IP process because it is messy, right? It's going to be pretty messy. It was messy with software, but we did figure it out. So what are the Magnificent Seven? Well, the scuffed one is the old movie from 1960 with Yul Brynner et al. They will be used to represent the protection that is provided because it's kind of one of those old Westerns where the good guys win kind of thing, anti-Cormac McCarthy type of thing. The other side of it is an excellent song, The Magnificent Seven by The Clash. And I don't know why it's called The Magnificent Seven. I think if it were, they did mention seven people in the song, right? So there's yeah, you know the song, right? So they mentioned Marx and Engels, and who else did they mention in there? They mentioned Socrates and Plato, Milhouse Nixon of all things, right? So there were seven people mentioned in the song, but the bottom line is I don't think that was what about. I think they were having fun, but that'll be the challenge. That'll be the clash. Something that's clashing in the world right now because of AI and IP. And so you'll see these little mnemonics in the corner. This is when we're looking at something that needs to be resolved. This will be the resolution. And we're going to talk about attribution, evaluation, and extension, which is a good introduction to what it means to have intellectual theft or plagiarism in this domain. We'll move on to training and deprecation, which means anti-training, if you will. We'll talk about ablation, how to actually work a network down to a size that does what it needs to and doesn't do what it doesn't need to. We'll talk about hallucination, right? And you were probably thinking, I've already thought that. I saw about hallucination today. No, we haven't talked about it yet, but we will. And then search engine versus generative behavior. So that's an important one because there's a lot of expectations that have been changed based on how people use the internet. And these are two extremes, if you will, in a continuum, search engine behavior versus generative behavior. And then we'll come back to recency bias, which we introduced before, and then energy. So what do instructors think of AI? We start off with AI in education and research. And it really does run the gamut from, hey, AI is a tool, or, students are tools. And we hear that in our own department. There's not full agreement even in the systems engineering department. Some of us are like, AI's out there. You use it, help your students use it. Other ones are like, can't use it. I'll be testing, blah, 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 right? So the obvious concerns here are when students plagiarize or outright steal stuff. And trust me, students do that. I've seen that firsthand with some of my students, right? So it's part of life. The real thing is we want students to move beyond that and to actually provide something more than just theft. So that's a concern. Also, what do the students think of AI, right? So students do not in general feel that other students should be able to just use it without attribution. Believe it or not, cheating by other students has never been something other students go, yeah, I'm into that, right? Because in some ways, either they're a non-competitive student and they just want things to be fair, or they're a competitive student and they realize that's a competitive disadvantage of some other students getting away with something where they're just don't know anything, but they're getting credit for it. So this is a big, important area, right? And I would say that the jury's still out on the impact of generative AI on what it does for critical student thinking. There have been a lot of papers that show particular personalities do not benefit at all from it. And if they use generative AI, they will definitely become too reliant on it and will, be a level of indirection from it. But we've had that going on for years, if you think about it, right? Way back before anything was online, you had to go dig stuff up at a library. I still had to do that for my, PhD. I had to drive down to the University of Denver to get all the references I needed. They weren't available online because the internet wasn't big until the mid-90s. And so this is the next stage of evolution. But I can understand why other people are concerned. How far out can you dereference content? Yeah, please.
The research that you were citing about some personality types getting kind of a negative effect from generative AI, did they look at like their associative memory capability, or do you know what to say?
I don't think they went as far as doing the, neural imaging or anything of that nature, but there are different personality types. Maybe it aligns up with, personality typing, and different types of people are going to benefit better from the dereferencing. But the jury's still out.
Do you remember which types? Like, was it big 5 personality types?
No, it would probably be like, advocate versus et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah. But anyway, there's no definitive answer on that yet. So what do we actually do with this? What we have to do with this is attribute, evaluate, and extend. So if you're going to use anything, you can't get away with just like copying something from Wikipedia, putting it in your, in your paper and saying, I did this, right? Somebody's going to be able to look it up. More than ever, people can do that. And so, as I said, the reality was until 1994, people actually sat at their desks and got work done without an internet. It seems weird, right? Because I'm like looking at this and I'm like, I used to have a computer and there was no internet. What did I do on it, right? But we did that, and those days are gone. Everybody has a computer on their desk now. And so until 2022, people sat at their desks and they got work done without generative AI. Those days are gone too. So people are going to use generative AI, and they're either going to spend a lot of time trying to obfuscate it because they want to cheat, or they're going to say, wow, I actually want to make this productive. I'm going to give attribution to the AI I use, talk about how I evaluated it, and then show how I extended it. And that will keep you from being too reliant on it, because if you're always at this expectation that I'm going to evaluate it and extend it, you will add intellectual property to it, which means you could actually get some type of IP around it, the other intellectual property. So many professors, I'm not going to judge this one way or another, but I'm on that side, recognize that AI skills development is important in most, if not all, careers in years to come, and we just have to accept that. This is part of it. It has limitations, so it's not like a preclusion for us to be able to allow people to shine. But from an intellectual property theft standpoint, remember that homeworks, papers, and projects are intellectual property. And so plagiarism is intellectual theft. It doesn't matter which class you're in. If you use AI without attribution, you're stealing. And so if you get caught, that's the same thing as being caught, like, the people at the Louvre the other day, right? You're taking these things out of there, right? It's the Louvre of the class. So non-attribution of the use of AI and generative AI is plagiarism. Yeah.
So normally if I'm doing a project or a paper and I am using information of a textbook, I don't cite my textbook. Is there a difference between?
You should, though. At the end of what you're doing, you should say that some of the content there came from reading this text, if it is something that you did use for the paper. Yeah, and my students are pretty good about that. I'm going through midterm grading hell right now, so I'm seeing all of this, and they're like, "Oh, I used AI to get an understanding of this, and this is what I've added." So, but yeah, attribution never hurts you, right? And it also is one of those things that doesn't make you look like a dumber person to give attribution. It shows that you know how to work with other smart people, which is kind of a sign of intelligence. It's what we want.
It seems like it could be onerous, because my process is I read a ton of stuff at my screen for 2 hours, and if I had to go back and put the 83 sites in,
well, you might not have to, but you have to talk about any that you actually borrowed an idea directly, and for the rest of those. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Number 2, the second clash we've got. What does the AI know? And this is really important because we want to frame how we're going to develop intellectual property off of what they already know. So does AI know more than just its training? Technically, no. It doesn't actually know more than what it's training, because the data on which it was trained in large part dictates the output of its processing. But some patterns are inferred from the training set. The AI is not yet conscious. And this means that AI kind of acts like a smoothing filter or a blurring filter, brings things together. So this AI, for example, has been trained on dachshunds and on horse racing, and we ended up with this out of it, right? And you'd go, well, that is clever. That's a new combination. But it is an averaging of what was actually out there. And patterns in training data can lead to some understanding of language or IDing objects, et cetera, without necessarily making predictions forward. And again, without sufficient data, AI and generative AI, which is GAI, will have limited variability. So speech, text, and image generation are dependent on massive amounts of training data. It's normally considered inference and not creativity, which means there's room for you to show the extension that's there. And so we'll look at the training and deprecation solution for this. So training data is a mixture of many types of IP, and unattributed open source data use is still IP theft. So if they're not telling you where they're getting it from, et cetera. Now, there are exceptions to this. So this is the old Asia album from the 80s. And I think you can all recognize where that came from. And there was a big suit here, but they decided, no, there was some inspiration of the color palette and everything else for Avatar, but it was not intellectual property theft. And so we're going to see a lot of that sort of nuance with AI. But when you do publish, you have to use public data sets with attribution. And if there is direct copyright violation or plagiarism, that'll be hard to get around. So I think that's important to understand. There is a limit to how much of this will actually be plagiarism, but there will be some. And if you end up with something that directly comes from the training data. So one of the prompts I first ran, and I don't know that this still works on one of the generative AIs, where I said, show me two, happy Italians who like to eat pizza, and I got Mario and Luigi. So that's clearly copyright violation, but is it? If the expectations were that that was going to act like a search engine, and we'll come back to that topic. All right, the third class that we've got, right, is the unwieldy size of AI. And this is a big deal for us, right? So Microsoft is talking about providing a personalized AI agent on your computer, massively undertrained, et cetera, et cetera. So if it's Ben using it, no problem. He's going to be adding a whole bunch of apps, doing a bunch on the system. It'll get trained pretty quickly. But if it's Grandpa playing Minesweeper and maybe sending a couple of texts every day, 99% of that space on his computer is a target for me to put malware on. And I know I can do that. I've already done it. So you look at the AI that's on there and you figure out how to hide malware in there so that it looks like an untrained or partially trained AI adjacent to the main path. So that becomes a very clear cybersecurity problem. You can hide malware in those unablated spaces of the AI. And keep in mind that training data includes private data, right? So the generative adversarial network software and hardware itself has a highly valuable AI in it, and things like ChatGPT, Claude, and Grok, which you've probably used. So if the hardware is manipulated or the training data is poisoned, who's responsible for the OS misbehaving? I mean, that's another good red team attack right now, right? And I just read the CISA report today. It made me scared. We've laid off people without knowing it in CISA and our cybersecurity, so our infrastructure is more exposed. Well, AI is just this huge, massive threat surface placed around the existing threat surface, kind of like onions have layers, an extra layer around it. So we really need to be worried about that. What if your training data, what if training data that you bring in compromises your private data? Who's responsible? Right? So along with IP, the flip side is responsibility. Who's involved in this? Do we want this in the automotive or critical infrastructure? So Alexandra Scalco's online. She and I just have a book coming out. I think it'll be available in February on cybersecurity for critical infrastructure. How much of AI do we want in that? And then who's responsible when power goes out, when water turns off? So does IP in the OS mean responsibility for AI? Or for other cybersecurity compromises? Who's responsible? Is it Microsoft? Is it the AI? Is it you for the training data you brought in? It's going to be a big issue. But it's an excellent IP play here if you can solve this, right? So again, the flip side of what we're talking about today, along with the risks, is what can you do with AI for IP? You can set up AI to protect systems along these lines using a combination of AI, machine learning, and probably expert systems. Yeah.
So with automotive, I mean, I could conceive of us creating self-driving cars that get into fewer accidents than humans do. But if the AI is behind the accidents that do happen, I mean, it seems like we're still better off.
It's going to have to play out statistically, isn't it? Yeah. What's the equivalent of AI being drunk, having bad training data, right? All right, so let's look at how we actually address this. So for, the size of the network there, I would use the rhyming triplet of ablate, await, and abate. So we need to actually trim back the network. This is an example of a neural network ablation on a very small scale. And remember, we're talking about things like ResNet 101 with billions of neurons and up to trillions now of connections between those. So this is definitely an oversimplification. But again, you recognize that certain types of neurons or cells have been taken out of here, and the connection that's left is the strength of the connection that we had there. So you trim it back to reduce the hack. It's a good mnemonic to remember that. And does ablation offer a cleaner path to IP? So this is an important thing to recognize, and a lot of times flipping things around gives you insight. Sometimes it actually gives you the solution. Sometimes it gives you insight into its opposite. And I think it does here. Show that your network is true to your invention by what it can't do. So if you say, I've got an invention around AI, and it's going to do X, Y, and Z, and you say, whoa, can it do A, B, and C? And you show that your network can't, then you go, okay, you've actually trained it and ablated it, and it is specific to that task. You have a much better chance of getting intellectual property granted for that. And again, copyright should include prevention of copy wrong. So if you have a copyright on something, it should also not be something that's just, it does everything under the sun, and I'm going to get a copyright on this part of it. That's not going to work. You're not going to get any intellectual property off of that. And again, proper ablation largely prevents side channels, which is other ways to work around it. So You have to do the equivalent from the cybersecurity community of red team, blue team attacking on your AI. Can I make it do something that it's not supposed to do? And that's a lot of fun. And Deb, you're probably doing some of that right now with some of the work you're doing, right? It's a lot of fun. So that's the ablate part. Cut the network back so that it does what you need to do efficiently and effectively, but you can show that it doesn't do things you're not supposed to do. And then you await. So you continue to train and untrain and ablate. And this is always a big part with AI because they want to dive in. Everybody wants to have everything. But in a lot of cases, we're undersubscribed with data. We need more data in that space. And so the AI is going to get smarter over time. Is there a way for you with this ablated network to accommodate new data? If not, you may have over-ablated it and you might have to do some retraining. Huge intellectual property opportunity is for you to take this massive network, ablate it down to doing what you want to do today, and then go, I want to do a few more things tomorrow and learn how to add on just enough back to that ablated network to get it to do the new things, but not add new risks of things it's not supposed to do. And then the third in this triad is abate, right? So you want to deprecate old data, right? So a huge IP opportunity is here for inverse training to remove input from the training set. How do you do that? And you're like, oh man, I don't know what I'm getting out of AI. I don't know how it worked. It's like, well, there you go. IP now is in getting it to do how, bespoken types of things. And this is one of the problems we have with AI. It's like, I don't know how I got there from there. And I don't have, yeah, you had a question, please.
Yeah. Is this covering the system of being modular as well? Like after you made it as small as possible, it can be.
Yeah, like parallel ablations or something. That's a great idea and a great chance for IP. So you got this huge network and you decide what the series parallel aspect of the whole system is going to be and work the ablation in there so that it only does what it's supposed to. Because we might want to have that car driving down the street, but we might not want the car whistling at somebody on a skateboard going by or something. And it's like, I don't want the car doing that, but it's possible you could get ablated out of there, right? So you decide I'll have these parallel paths for driving, for parking, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, it's a great opportunity there. And the inverse training to remove that input from the data set so that it's no longer relevant. So suppose AI was around 100 years ago, back in steampunk age, and it was training to watch out for the horse and buggy coming by. We might want to deprecate that information, right? Maybe we want it to work in, southeastern Iowa where the Amish are, but for the most part, we don't want that working, right? So you might want to think about toning that down. So again, IP could be asserted directly with a test for specific copyrighted material being in the training set by showing the impact of its removal. And this is going to be very powerful. So we're going to have court cases going in there and you're going to go, you use my training data, right? Like LibGen, and we'll talk about that more later. And you'll say, well, how do I know that you used it? Well, I've got this AI that can go back through another AI and show that that training data was here by effectively removing it, doing this, contradicting that training data and showing that the network changed in its behavior. That'll be really cool. And that is meta where AI is today, but we will get there. All right, the fourth class that we've got, are we seeing things, right? And this is something most people are concerned about, right? What is hallucination? And it arises when AI returns factual errors. You go, well, that's okay. AI is like that, really nice person I know who doesn't know anything, but every time I ask them something, they want to help. So they just make something up to go along with it. We all know somebody like that, right? And, great people, but it's like, oh man, I can't trust a word out of your mouth, right? All right, so the causes for AI hallucination, though, are that there are model decoding issues that add to the diversity of response. So we go into the AI and we tweak it so that it will provide something that looks more like creativity. We add more diversity of response. And so we saw that a few slides back. Well, that's definitely a diverse response. But that's probably not what we had in mind when we wanted to show people horse racing, right? So this is a big issue for us. We have to figure out how to train that off. And then, of course, there's divergent data in the training set. So if you trade it on a subreddit, right, with people screaming at each other from both sides of any fence, political fence, whatever, right? So if you do that, it'll be like, okay, I can get both answers out of that, and I don't know which of these is authoritative. And then there's artifacts or intentional mistruths in the training data. Can anybody think of public figures who intentionally lie? That's just not feasible, right? We can't even imagine that. And then the last one, bias in the settings towards novelty and utility. So they're going to add variety to avoid obvious IP infringement. In other words, they're trying to cover their tracks. And this can also lead to mistruths. And of course, if you're in the bubble that is AI right now, and who knows when that's going to pop and what it's going to look like when it does, you're going to try to make it look as valuable as you possibly can, which means you're going to try to make it look as creative as possible. All four of these things together lead to hallucinations. Does it mean AI is unreliable? No, it means it can be unreliable. And that means there's opportunity there for us as engineers to figure it out. So often, I guess, excuse me, to boil that down, hallucination is a consequence of AI trying to minimize its chance of getting caught cheating. Right? It's like a student doing this on an exam and not admitting they used AI. And so what if the hallucination is only currently untrue? That's a more interesting question from an IP standpoint. So suppose you had AI before the iPhone came out in 2007 or was announced in 2006, and an AI anticipated the iPhone and showed somebody carrying an iPhone around. Well, we can see old Star Trek episodes, old Twilight Zone episodes doing something like that. And it's like, does that preclude the IP that Apple got with it? No. But if it was more specific, it might. So if the AI anticipated the iPhone in 2003 and pretty much nailed it, who owns the IP for that if the AI predicted it? So this is actually key to the future of AI and IP. Who owns what when this comes out? So again, there's at least two forms of hallucination that are a direct consequence of AI trying to hide the fact that it's cheating. And the first one is the diversity of response. Okay, I'm just going to make this so that it does a bunch of random stuff so that somebody can't see A, B, C, and D in here, and hopefully the mishmash of those four is nobody's going to figure out what I used. And the second one is bias in the settings towards novelty, all of which shows that AI developers, sorry, if you're out there, you're very cognizant of your IP theft. That's where we are right now. All of them know they're stealing people's data, right? And so more germane to number 4 of the Magnificent Seven is what happens when the lie becomes the truth, right? What actually happens there? So hallucinations are open source because the public can create them. What if IP is actually created from a hallucination? So that randomness, that combination of that leads to something that looks useful and novel. And from that search, into the AI space, you develop something that yourself you try to turn into IP. So this means whether or not you have stolen that data or whether or not they have stolen that data, there's going to be some type of a lawsuit involved. Yeah.
So if you train on something that's publicly available on the web, I mean, is that considered theft?
It's going to be at least partial theft. Right? If it generated something that was novel and somebody can prove that training data, again, going back a couple of slides and knowing how to remove the effect of that training data, if somebody can show that training data was instrumental in creating that, then they'll be able to sue you. And we will get better at that. We'll be better at actually deprecating training data, as I said in an earlier point, and being able to establish that training data was core to creating that IP that came out of it.
So does the metaphor with like a human artist not hold up then? So if I am studying art and I look at a bunch of different artists and I use those to develop, the things that I can do in the world of art, that's not normally considered.
That'd be considered inspired, but that's also fair use, right? And so there will be, what we don't have right now is what the establishment of fair use is for AI. And so what'll happen is we will eventually get a good definition of that, but it's going to go through some pretty ugly class action suits at the beginning. These are coming, right? Because that's how IP works. All right. Number 5. So the search engine versus generative behavior. This one was important. We said we'd come back to it. Does it search or does it simply generate? Right? Are we actually doing generative AI or are we doing search-based behavior? And this is really important for us to understand because when the internet became, de rigueur, as I say, in the mid-90s, there was a lot of controversy over what was IP theft, right? This is only 3 decades ago, right? So Gutenberg Press came out in 1453, and for, 500 years, we kind of knew what intellectual property theft was, right? If you took somebody's text and you lifted it, put it somewhere else, an image. But then when the internet came around, it's like, wait, I'm definitely seeing somebody else's paper. I'm seeing their words. I'm seeing their image. And I'm using this, cutting and pasting it into my document. You have to give attribution. What happens now when it's generative and we don't know which data it was trained on, right? So when distributed software in the cloud became, very popular in the early 2000s, and again, the internet bubble's nothing new. We had a cloud bubble. We had an early internet bubble, everything else. There was controversy over business process patents. And that extended all the way out until we had a decision called the Alice decision, which is the Alice Corp versus the CLS Bank. And that established finally a set of tests for patent eligibility. And if the claim is based on an abstract idea, right, or solely implemented on a computer, that's not patentable. So you're like, oh, okay, I've got this idea of doing something and I just implement it only on a computer. You can't patent that, right? So that basically means you've just got something in theory and you just implement it on a computer. So a simulation. So us as systems engineers were thinking about that, a digitally engineered simulation, that's not patentable. You've done a simulation, so what? So you can't get a patent on that. Abstract concepts and business methods, this is more difficult to patent. And there's a lot of concepts over that, like, okay, if I'm just taking something that already existed, I hand a set of papers off to, that I've handwritten over to my admin assistant, and the admin assistant types it up, and you say, well, now I can do this on the computer by scanning the document in and then turning it into type. That's not going to happen as an abstract principle. What you'll have to do is show new methods and procedures that actually go with that. And so they did end up saying that software patents can still be granted, but they have to improve the technical functionality of either the network or the computer. Right? So it can't just be something that takes something that already existed and putting it on a computer. So the same type of thing applies here. We will see you can't just take something and apply it to AI and then say it's brand new. All right, so this is exemplified by the difference between the LibGen, which I said we'd come back to, and the Jazz incidents. So Anthropic agrees to pay $1.5 billion, that's still a lot of money, to settle their copyright lawsuit. That was last month, right? So what happened was Anthropic was clearly taking all of these authors' works and using them as training data and then spitting out literature that was like, wait a second, that kind of looks like Anna Burns or something, and found out, oh yeah, all of Anna Burns's books are in there, including Milkman. And you're like, wow, this book has a real Milkman feel to it. Oops. So $1.5 billion, because they had to admit it was obvious that they'd stolen all of this work. But when Jazz came out in January 2018, it went to #1 on the Billboard and then was out of the charts the week following. So locations it was being listened to were a cue that something was awry. So Jazz came out in January of 2018. It was an album and it became #1 on billboards for 1 week, and then the next week it disappeared. And you found out that all of the places listening to this album were in Vietnam or other places that didn't traditionally listen to music like that. It was clearly a spoof. So this shows that misbehavior when the user expects search behavior is more tolerated than misbehavior when generative behavior is expected not to be based on existing IP. So this is a big deal. If you expect search behavior, you expect there to be loosely some type of IP, considerations there. Like it might be showing you copyrighted material because that's what a search engine does. So if I type in Van Gogh paintings, I expect to see paintings by Van Gogh. I don't expect to see paintings that don't infringe on Van Gogh's copyright, because it's like, well, that's not his painting, and it's going to have to be different enough that it's actually not relevant to me. So the real key here is, what do we actually do with our expectations for search versus creating new information or new material? That's a big thing for us, right? So extended search is an excellent IP strategy for AI. What are we actually doing? Rather than represent it as generative AI, you'll start to see people representing it as extended search. I'm providing search, but I'm also providing search with a little bit of generation around it. So then the AIs will be attributing where their training data came from and not trying to claim copyright, but they're going to try to claim, adjacency to existing copyrights to give you a flavor for it and maybe give you more ideas. Yeah.
So the summary of multiple sources by AI for a web search fall under
that would be like an extended search. Absolutely. Yeah. And as long as they're not, if there's any direct quotes, they attribute them and give quotations and all of that, that's normal behavior. So that's not going to be infringement. Right. But also we live in an open source freeware Coursera world, right? And we may not, respect IP the way the USPTO and other places do, and other countries don't respect IP as much as the US, and the US, in fairness, probably doesn't respect IP as much as Europe does, right? So there's differences across the world in this. When search is represented as creation, that's where we have the contradiction. And so really that's our defining point there. It's like, okay, I get it. If it says it's generative AI and that it's creation, but it's clearly search, it's based on somebody else's work, that's theft. So that's easy. And so what we really can do as people who are concerned about that, about taking away all of the rights that the creative folks have, we can come up with ways to actually determine whether or not it's search or generation. And that's a huge area for you to do IP generation. So does generative AI constitute an abstract idea? When it does, it cannot be patentable. When it doesn't, it had better improve the technical functionality. So if you've got generative AI that doesn't improve the technical, functionality, you can't get any IP around it. And when it does, libgen should loom, right? Training set transparency is going to be legislated. And you're going to have to admit this was trained on this, so then people can fairly go in knowing a priori which training data this was based on and say, is there actually an infringement there? And it'll actually help the AI folks as well, because they will then be able to only have those things legislated, and they'll be able to defend why something is so similar, right? So if you end up with something that looks very much like Vincent van Gogh, and you haven't admitted that he was in the training data, then you have problems. Yeah, you had a question, please?
Yeah, so that the extended search piece is for a while not perplexing me, where like it's very transparent about, hey, you're getting these sources, and here's how we recreate the summary or whatever I'm trying to teach you from these sources. I think more of a generative AI are doing that now, like actually transparently citing the sources.
Yep.
But I'm not sure if anybody else experience that too, of getting that additional like this is search, not just like maybe something.
Exactly. So they're actually not misrepresenting what they're doing. It's an extended search. And so that is going to be legislated, and training set transparency will be as well, which gives us a lot of opportunity, right? Because then we lead right back into what we talked about, attribution, evaluation, and extension being something that's not only defensible, but in the extension part is patentable, because you're actually improving the technical functionality of an extended search AI, right? So when you put it in that framework, you've got yourself an entire dynamo for generating new intellectual property. But you have to start with the admission, and that of course shows up in the text when you write up a patent. That's the prior art. You're like, this is prior art. I can't make this claim, so anybody else can go use the same exact extended search AI and go build something else. But if what you've done is not obvious, it's novel, and you can move forward with it, then you can get IP around it. So that will happen. All right, so the recency bias, right? Our clash here is that we're biased to what's happened. And this happens a lot. This is not just a generational issue, but if you talk to the younger the person you talk to is, the more likely they're going to have recency bias, because they don't go back farther, right? So it's kind of structural. It's not like there's something wrong with them, but they're like, you go talk to a 7-year-old and say, wow, who is the most important US president? And they're like, there's been more than one? What? It's going to be recency bias, right? Because they don't have that concept. So recency bias is when a model overemphasizes the prevalence or importance of recent information. And there's no reason for that to be the case. Contextualizing that means that the engine needs to tell you how broad it goes back. And you may even end up with curves telling you how far back in time these things have gone. So this can lead to decreased accuracy, to decreased broad relevance, and several types of hallucination. Obviously, if you don't, or reinvention of the wheel, right? If you didn't include the invention of the wheel in your IP, in your AI might go, this is a great way to move vehicles around. We should put this round object on them. And you're like, yeah, those are called wheels, right? All right, so in psychology, recency bias is cognitive bias, and we have to be concerned about this when we're talking about how AI changes our cognition, right? So as for AI, it means favoring more recent events to historical events. And as Santayana said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, or maybe privileged to repeat it if you can get a patent on a tire. Keep in mind that after Glasnost, what rolled through Russia, the companies moved in very quickly and got patents on glass and beer. And I'm not kidding. And they were charging people for using glass or for brewing beer in Russia, not understanding what IP is, right? All right, so the consistent impact of a final summary or a lecture shows you that recency bias always plays, right? I'm going to have a summary, a last thing, and it's going to be, expect you to remember it better than every other slide in the talk. Recency bias flat out works. It's part of being human. But overreaching to prevent recency bias can result in the lack of proper deprecation on the other side. So I don't want to just go in there and say, who had a great pitching and batting game the other night, and I keep getting Babe Ruth. It's like Shohei did, right? So you've got to have both of those in there, right? So we want to make sure that we have proper deprecation of old data and old facts, and that we do emphasize new enough. So if current generative AIs train future GAIs, then both falsehoods and antiquated facts can continue to promulgate. And this is a real problem for us because we are using massive, like ChatGPT 4.0 is a big part of training ChatGPT 5.0. So we can see, myths, mistruths, intentional lies, everything else promulgating forward until there is no way for you to roll back to see what it was originally. And this is going to be used by tyrants and other types of deceptive people throughout the planet. But fortunately, there's a lot of areas here for us to invent. So untraining, right? That intelligent deprecation we talked about before is a huge area for intellectual property development. If you're coming up with ways to untrain a network, to say, okay, I admit I used all of these Van Gogh paintings in my AI. Now, how do I remove them? Well, man, ChatGPT 5.0 is not going to be easy to do that to. So if you had a way of actually doing that so that it didn't work on there, basically, properly selectively ablating that training data, that would be immense. Proving the presence of specific data or data sets, as I alluded to. If you have a way, an insight into how to do that, something that's unique to that data set that you can then show through the removal of it. First off, you have to be able to remove it, as we said up there, the untraining, but then you can show that you don't get this type of output. You can show that that training set was used in the AI generation. Of course, licensing data sets with with IP sharing is a huge IP area. You purposely generate data sets that you allow AIs to train on for a price. And you say, this is why it works better, and this is what you actually have to admit. So if you were able to create licensed data sets that were not copyright infringements, that's a great place for the revenge of the artist, right? Because the artist is like, oh man, everybody's doing stuff with AI, I can't get a job anymore. And you're like, wait a second, what if you create training data sets that don't have any copyright infringement because people have got better at these two above here, and all of a sudden they're getting sued for this, and you provide a training set that doesn't do that? That's going to be pretty cool. So you'll actually have people who are able to find new art that we can train AI on, that the AI generators aren't stealing somebody else's intellectual property on. And then, of course, there's going to be topical ablation for sensitivity analysis. That could be a design guide as well. How do we actually reduce topics that we don't want out there? So there becomes a sensitive topic. I don't know where you are. You're in some part of the world where they don't want you talking about alcohol at all. So you have to selectively get rid of every mention of alcohol in your training data so that that is not something that is generated by the search or the generative AI behavior. Yeah.
So I've heard that if you have 3 influences as a musician, you're going to sound derivative. If you have 100 influences, you're going to sound original. And so is there a point in there where if you want something that's in a genre, can you train on 1,000 songs in that genre, 1,000 paintings in that genre, and then create something that's original because you can't really trace what it is, and if you there's no specific artists you can take out of the training set in order to get a significant different answer?
Well, it kind of comes back to what you mean by original. If you're training, the more that you train on in that genre, the more derivative it'll sound. It just won't be easy to identify what your original source was. So it might not be something that is legislatively provably, based on one particular artist, but it's probably going to be derivative. And in most cases, it'll be an averaging value of that. And that's already happening. I mean, you can already go in, Jeff Ewing, who's worked with me on a music book, and I have gone in and looked at a few of the ways of doing this, and it'll sound decent. It'll sound like that genre, and you don't know exactly who it came from, but it's also derivative. So it's not necessarily, compelling.
We all think that genres are not supposed to sound derivative because we don't understand the nuance inside of that genre, right?
Yeah, but if somebody can, pick out a particular baseline or something else that is, unique, then you're going to be able to be, held responsible for that. All right. So again, the way around this is to attribute anything that you've used, to evaluate it and to extend it and show what you've done. And if you have extended it, then what will happen is that you will have no independent or dependent claims on what had already been done. You'll just start with this baseline. But that's been happening in IP anyway, right? You don't get a patent today that you're like, oh, I have to show you how these chips were set up, then how they were put on a board, then how this was constructed, and that an OS was added to it. And then I've got this, and I'm running this software that does this one thing. You just go, that exists, and I do this one thing. And we understand that you're doing this on some type of a computer, and actually the vernacular for that has become very straightforward over time. And I notice the chat's built up. Is it people asking questions online? See a few. Let's see. I don't know how many of these came in. Oh, somebody did a read stop because somebody's AI came in to do this meeting. You like it? And that AI is going to take the output of my slides and generate a patent from what I did. Second bullet in top. Yeah, I think there were a couple of typos. I thought I fixed those, but this might be an old version of the slides. Dean, that's easy. How are they handling current cases like that AlphaFold? Do they own IP around any new protein structure identified? Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, if it's something that exists in nature, Vinny, you won't own the IP for it. If it's something brand new, then you will own typically the process by which it's created, which if it's AI is not going to be easily defensible. But if you have tied that back to a production, you'll be able to use that. So that's, and of course, if you have a way of doing that, like out with AlphaFold, that might fall under what's called a Marcouche law, which means that every possible protein in this area that you generate through AI is related to each other to keep you from getting a patent on each of those. So there'll be some trade-off there between it not being patentable at all, and only the process for doing it is there, and having the process generate up to millions of different proteins that are all related to each other. That's called a Marcouche, Markush law. Joel says, back in the mid-90s, as a IT developer, I've jumped to learning about internet. In 2000, I've jumped to using AI, the realms of IP vis-a-vis. Yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about all through this, Joel. So hopefully we're answering that. Should I be using more of the US-based LLMs, DeepSeek, et cetera? I don't have any particular opinion on which ones you use at this point. Good question, though. All right, so the last of the clashes that we've got is energy. We're here in the You can hear energy being used out on the tracks here. So we're here in the powerhouse. Energy is huge. In 2020, data centers and data transmission networks produced 0.6% of humanity's global warming greenhouse gas emissions. It's already 4 to 5% in the US, and it's going to go up to about 15% in the next 3 to 5 years. So this means that all of a sudden, 9% change in overall energy usage over 20 years, we're going to see more than that in 5 years due to AI. So Rachel Carson's rolling in her grave. Everything that we've done for Green Earth has basically been eliminated by this. And this is something, and so we have to ask ourselves, is this worth it? Is this something we want? Do we want, Colorado to turn into Arizona over the next 5 years so that we have AI? This is a real point we have to discuss. And I'm not trying to be dismissive of AI. I'm saying we have to have that discussion, right? And a US DOE study, as I said, predicts we're going to probably go somewhere between 10 and 15% in the next 3 years. So clean wind and solar power are a poor fit for data centers because they require round-the-clock energy. And if the growth rate of generative AI matches predictions, they'll rely on natural gas with all of the implicit climate warming that's happened. And this is already happening in Virginia and Texas. In Dublin, which Paul is near, one of the guests online, in Ireland, over 50% of the electricity in the Dublin or Meath area, the capital of Ireland, is used on data centers. It's already hit 50% in some jurisdictions. So that's amazing when you think about it. It's just kind of shocking. So the energy, as you can see, the efficiencies that gains have been decelerating for the renewable energies, and the power demand is increasing, and AI is now this huge impact on what's going on there. So energy happens to be a pretty serious issue, right? And policy and governance are going to impact this. And anytime you talk about policy and governance, that directly feeds into how IP is treated and created. So this is something we have to consider. And both the IP and the energy situations are unprecedented, which means I can speculate on this, but it's going to go different than even I say here, even with my experience in IP. We don't know where it's going to go. It is unprecedented. And the cost to society of AI might need to be returned from the IP proceeds. It's just a normal thing to ask. If you guys are generating all this, everyone has been spending the last 60 years trying to reduce the amount of, fossil fuel usage, and you come in and force it onto other industries by taking up all of the renewable energy and forcing them to go back to nuclear, going back to coal, going back to gas. Maybe you need to do that. Will the IP cover the increased energy costs? Will the intellectual property being developed be worth it? This is a question we have to ask. So will there be an energy tax or energy fee? Who will be responsible for that energy, right? Will it get merged? How will it be calculated and certified? These are not easy questions to answer. So if you go there and you type in a single chat onto a video, generative AI, it's using as much power as turning a microwave on for an hour. One prompt. So if you are somebody who's going, I got to do a marketing thing and I'm going to look good with the boss, and I run 1,000 prompts through, I've run 1,000 microwaves for an hour worth of energy. Was it worth it? And who's responsible for that? It's being hidden in the data center right now. It's not going to be hidden there forever. People are going to be, paying for this, right? They're getting us hooked. Will it get metered? How will that be metered? Monitor. Well, that means lack of privacy and probably a lot of cybercrime to try to take your searches. You'll go, I don't want to pay for those microwaves. I'm going to dump it on him. And so you force the searches on him or go, I wasn't at my desk. I'll fake a video that shows him typing it into my computer. This could happen easily. Think about how to attack this. What is the red team attack? So this is right now unpoliceable. So where does it go? Yeah.
Why is it unpoliceable? I mean, the data centers are already paying for the energy and they have to pass that cost on to whoever's using their system.
And somebody's using it from an anonymous system or denies using it or has somebody else using their machine. Or, yeah.
Paying for it. I mean, and it's a pay per use.
Then they'll have to cover the cost. Well, then people will stop using it too.
Yeah.
When the real costs of AI are out here, we'll see that. Yeah. So if the IP is assigned to an entity, shouldn't the entity be responsible for the energy required? I mean, that's the next thing I'm saying on the slide. So if you're using the AI, it should be assessed and you should be saying, hey, that energy that you used is actually worth $50. And you're not paying for that. You've got a, $9.99 a month fee or something. So we've got this huge imbalance in how it's being used. So if the IP cannot be assigned, then the profits can be garnered for the energy costs. So if the IP cannot be assigned to anyone, then the profit of that industry has to somehow feed back to the energy that's used. It's going to be interesting. All right, so what's next? Well, if you're interested in this will be part of ENGR 525, which is next spring. I guess that's on Thursday nights in the spring. And I think it's cross-listed with like 5 colleges on campus. It's easy to get your advisor to let you into the class. The precursors aren't that terrible. And also, Kieran and I are under contract to write a book on the intellectual property, understanding systems around inventions and intellectual property, people, processes, and patents. And so this will be a small part of that, but the bigger part of it is how we actually generate IP. AI offers some new challenges, but we've addressed those in the past with everything from broadcast. Believe it or not, there was a huge impact on patenting when radio came out, when TV came out, when the internet came out, when the cloud came out, when mobile phones came out, mobile computing came out, and we're going to see another transformation here with IP as well. All right, with that, I would just point out that the entire premise of this talk was an IP ripoff. Because if you look back far enough, the Magnificent Seven movie was entirely based on the Seven Samurai from 1954, 6 years later. And we've been using the premise of the Magnificent Seven the whole time when they were actually IP theft of the Seven Samurai. So it's going to be hidden in plain sight, just like this was hidden in plain sight, a lot of the intellectual property theft that's out there. Fortunately, as engineers and especially as system designers, there's a ton of room for us to be creative, not just in interpreting whether or not AI was used, but also in terms of how to augment that augmented search behavior and make new inventions out of that. So we have some issues to deal with. Energy is a mess, as we talked about. I don't have a solution there. But these identify some of those and also give us some hope. There's a lot of places for us to be creative with AI as a component. And keep in mind, AI isn't some end goal, right? It's not like, oh, I can't wait to have AI, right? AI is a tool. Just like a lot of other things we've learned to use, engineers are good with tools. I've heard you're pretty good with tools. This is another tool. So we learn how to be good with it, right? All right, with that, my talk is done. We've had some good questions throughout. If there's any questions at the end, I'll be glad to field those now. Thanks. Yeah.
So in around AI and machine learning, what keeps you up at night? And on the flip side of that, what are you excited about?
Well, I think I've given you a lot of the excitement here. I think what keeps me up at night is there's going to be so much wasted time and energy on intellectual property theft fighting battles. It's going to cost billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to legislate all of this. There's going to be a lot. It's going to be messy. And I think that's going to stifle creativity. The energy thing also keeps me up at night. What excites me about this? There's tremendous about this is a new tool. I can take all of the existing, model-based systems engineering approaches I have towards advanced analytics, and AI is just a tool that I plug in, just like I used to plug in Bayesian, SVMs, other types of things. And now it's just a little more intelligent, but I can still use hybrid systems to create better output, to govern things like improperly ablated networks, to govern hallucination, to govern all these other things that are generated. So yeah, it is an exciting time, but it's also going to be cringe. We're going to have, that's how everything is, right? There's some excitement and then there's like, oh, man, I don't want to deal with that. What, you said you had another question? Or that was it? Okay, let me check online. There's like 6 new ones.
Doctor.
Yeah, go ahead. If you're online, there's too many in the chat. Why don't you just go ahead and ask? Go ahead.
Dr. Simske, that's the one here. So I understand that the energy aspect is a very important concern for you, but I eventually I do have hope it will settle out, because if you consider the situation back in the 50s or early 40s with vacuum tubes that were used for the early computers, and they were very inefficient. They heated up the entire rooms and they took a lot of infrastructure, and then eventually evolved to miniaturization, with the transistor and then integrated circuits to kind of catch up with the demand of data processing. And then the energy followed suit into being more effective, more efficient. I think with the market and demand and all that, eventually that would happen, hopefully, with improvements of how energy production, and even also in making all the processing components that are used for AI more efficient, more energy efficient. So I do have hope, and I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people working on that across the world. So, but I'm just thinking about previous cases where energy seems to be very lagging in efficiency compared with data processing.
Yeah. And I mean, there's always, maybe it'll be quantum, maybe they'll find a way to actually set up the data center so that all the heat that's being generated can be repurposed for some other task. There's lots of possibilities, and those are areas for IP as well. But right now, yeah, it's not going that way because the expansion is so quick that we're not able to keep up with it in terms of research for repurposing or reducing that energy. But I'm with you. We'll eventually get there for sure. Thanks. Thanks, Esteban. Other questions in the room? Yeah, please.
Yeah, kind of what you said about how it's moving so quickly. I remember listening to a podcast where like some high officials or older people like all signed a document and said like we have to slow down when we use AI. So like policy can to know how to do this. What are your thoughts on with us trying to build the plane while we're trying to fight the same?
Yeah, I mean, we know from history, as soon as you make a technology illegal, people who are used to operating illegal use the technology. So it is one of those things that you got to keep your hands dirty. Basically putting policy and governance in that is restrictive is not the right solution. Putting policy and governance in along the lines of what Esteban said and about what we talked to in terms of doing adjacencies to existing generative AI output is where we go. And so what you say for this is like, you can't restrict people, but you have to require them to, give full attribution like anything else. And when they're caught, then the penalties have to be pretty high, right? Just like it is for a student who takes AI, generates an entire, thesis out of it, and then the thesis is published, and then we can prove it was done with AI. Guess what? They didn't graduate then, right? The thesis is there and they're thrown out of school. So there has to be that willingness to actually hold through when somebody's had multiple chances to admit what they were doing and just won't do it, right? And there are people who just, lie congenitally, right? So that's always going to be the case. But I think restricting it, what you'll have is all the really good people will follow the legislation that says not to use it. And then all the really bad people will just keep getting better at it. So I don't think that's a great solution. I mean, there's probably a great solution in there in some ports, but overall, it's just not, it's not conducive with human nature, right? Yeah. Yeah.
So people, a lot of times I think, feel like creativity is this magical thing, but creativity and the novelty requirements inside of a patent, we are frequently just taking technologies that exist and kind of pasting them together in a new environment to call that an invention. And I would say that, you know, even Einstein, what he did, we think of that as super novel relativity, but it did come directly out of Maxwell's equations, and to think long and hard about that path. But I mean, it's all incremental.
No, the most creative people in the world are always thought to be crazy because there isn't that context.
Yeah.
So Einstein was brilliant, but part of why he was recognized as brilliance is it was at the right time too.
Yes.
So
yes.
the timing's really important. And Clifford saying, I expect patents may be more difficult to obtain as examiners get more AI-enabled tools. Absolutely correct. Motivation to combine references would become even broader. Also, damages can be reduced or eliminated if derivation is proven. Having access to AI might be a presumption of derivation. Absolutely. Yeah. And this is it's gonna impact a lot of what is considered creative, because AI, if somebody can show that AI produces something that is patently, no pun intended, similar to what you've done, it's going to be very easy for them to strike it.
I do a lot of
Thanks, Clifford.
work, and I feel like a lot of the stuff that's in there, if you did 5 engineers, the problem, 2 or 3 of them would have come up with what you're trying to patent already. And as AI gets better at synthesizing from different disciplines and using metaphor and extending a little bit, if it comes up with all the same solutions that we would technically as well, I mean, where are we at then?
Yeah, I know. Well, it is going to change. I mean, this is why this is I appreciate Deb asking me to do this talk. This is a huge discussion.
Yeah.
When you start looking at how AI, and as Clifford pointed out, it's not just what we do with the IP generation, but it's how AI is used to show whether or not something is not. Yeah. And Steve backed on the energy, said P&L predicts 500 terawatts of energy needed by 2035 in just the Western states. There you go. All right. Any other questions? I know we're at time. Okay. Oh. Did she? I didn't. Am I missing it?
I did. I raised my hand.
Oh, you
I
raised your
really,
hand. Okay.
I value, I know you're at time. I really value this conversation. You talked about the energy, and there are so many areas, particularly just sucking the water out of our water tables and just the consumption of potable water. And there's so many areas. And I'm just really appreciative of the talk you gave, because I think there's opportunity for IP, as you mentioned, across to other areas. You know, if we can find ways where the data centers that consume millions of gallons of drinking water are perhaps reduced to in a way, or reuse, and it's really going to take understanding that IP and being able to pull that thread back to what we're actually trying to achieve. So this was a very valuable lecture. Thank you. Learned a lot.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks all for being here. I think I'll ask Deb to go ahead and close it down then. So, and I hope you enjoy the podcast for those of you watching later.